Thank you for watching our very special, still socially distanced journal talk this Monday. My name is Ivy Lyons, and I believe you all have seen me enough on this page.
And I'm Alana Kefalogianni. Before we begin, we wanted to make sure that we thanked all of the other SPJ chapters that participated in this event, the students who chose to click the links in our Instagram and Twitter bios, and our guests for tonight. If you want to stay updated on everything that we are doing this semester, feel free to follow the links in the description below or visit www.georgetownspj.com for more. We post often, and we are always here for you in tough times.
A reminder that these questions are anonymous for the most part, excluding the first question from one of our Journal Talks guests. This is to provide free and open space with the understanding that SPJ serves a moderating role when taking on questions for guests. We will do our best to ensure that the spirit of your questions are honored. And as always, we want to thank you again.
Now we would like to welcome our professors, fellow journalists, and tonight's ethical guru professor and interim faculty director, Carol Feldman, and Professor Delise Smith-Barrow. Starting with Carol, we'd love for you to tell us where you work and why you made the decision to go into journalism.
Thank you, Elena and Ivy. Again, I'm Carol Feldman. I work full-time at the Associated Press as a news editor. Why I decided to go into journalism, it was a long time ago. I was in 4th grade and I started writing for my elementary school newspaper. I like being able to witness things happen as they did and to tell my classmates about it. And I just kept moving on to a bigger and bigger scale. It's wonderful, as it's been said, journalists have, the first eyes on history. And I just love being in that role and being able to inform the public so they can make the decisions that they need to make to be productive members of society.
Thank you, sorry, and Delise Smith-Barrow, go ahead. Getting tongue-tied. And Delise Smith-Barrow, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. As Ivy said, my name is Delise Smith-Barrow. And so I guess this will be news to my Georgetown University family. But in terms of where I work, I'm currently a senior editor at the Hechinger Report covering higher education. But in 2 weeks, I will be the education editor at Politico. So I'm actually in between jobs, but same beat, which is education. And in terms of how I got into journalism, similar story to Carol. I pretty much knew since I was a child, around 7 or 8, I started creating like newspapers and whatnot for my dolls and stuffed animals to read while I was at school. I just really enjoyed writing and storytelling. And I think once I got to college, I figured out that I could keep writing and keep creating stories, but that were real. And I became really, really into journalism. So I majored in it. And it's the only industry I've worked in because I just really enjoy, highlighting different communities, different issues, national, local. So I just love the aspect of storytelling and the power that it brings.
I love that in news fashion, you broke that wonderful news there that you are now going to be at Politico. I think Elena and I probably, I think we both made a face, and that face was of excitement. Congratulations on that. But, from that extremely happy news into the first question. The first question is actually from Live in Washington's Evelyn Den Epele. She says she would like to know what is considered ethical in a response to a request to delete or unpublish a journalistic piece. So a text or audio or video story. Let's say you've conducted an interview and drafted an article based on responses from that interview. Then shortly after it's been vetted by an editorial desk and published, your interviewee explicitly requests for the published article to be taken down due to reasons like fear for their life or audience pushback or even threats or political targeting. what will be the right approach to handling the situation? We'll start with Carol, then Delise, and follow that pattern for the time being. So Carol?
That's a tough question because once something is published, it's out there and you don't know how many people have seen it, where it's gone. So it's really difficult to take things down. What I would do would be to try to talk to this person and find out specifically, why the person wants the piece taken down. What kind of pushback are they receiving? What kind of threats? And then try to make an assessment about whether this is a credible reason or not. If it's just that the person just, decides that, oh, it's not what I really want to say, or I didn't mean to say that, well, that's not a valid reason. As I tell my ethics students, decisions should not be made in a vacuum, that I would, talk to my supervisors, to my bureau chief, and then together we would make a decision. But again, once something is out there, it's out there, given the way that news is published across the internet.
That's a good point. Delise?
Yeah, I agree with Carol that, once something is published, it's out there. Even taking it down doesn't always remove it. People can take screenshots. There still might be print copies circulating. So that's one thing. But I would also question the validity of these threats, only because if the person is that fearful, this is something that will usually come up in the reporting process long before publication. So I would kind of wonder who was making the threat. Did it seem really warranted? And it might be a matter more for the police more than the news outlet. But usually, if it's very sensitive information, there's been lots of conversations with your editors, with your news director, and certainly with your source long before it's published. So I would kind of ask what's happening now, what has changed in your life now that's made you afraid, and try to get more details before making any type of call to story.
I understand that. Elena?
Do you think that journalists need to challenge objectivity? And what about the attempt to be unbiased in this current political moment?
I can take that, Elena. Journalists, journalists need to be unbiased as they're reporting on politics. The politics is dividing the country. There are such clear lines being drawn at this particular time over the election. I think that if journalists, present, a view in favor of one side or another, it would affect their credibility and, and their trustworthiness among viewers. That said, journalists need to report both sides of the issue, but they also need to be, really, vigilant about fact checking. You don't want someone's statements, false statements standing out there, without that kind of fact checking, if it's spreading, a false narrative.
Delise?
I think that, objectivity is certainly the goal. I think it can be hard to execute because everyone walks into a story with certain beliefs or certain background that might make them more inclined to believe one thing over another. So with that in mind, I think as a journalist, you have to do your best at being accurate and giving the proper context to whatever the story is. So like I tell my students, you can be factual, you can be accurate, but you can still be biased. So I think your goal should be to execute journalism that is factual, that is accurate and unbiased. You might have certain beliefs or think about things in a certain way, but I think you have to try your best not to make those beliefs color your judgment to the point where you can't even attempt objectivity. You're only operating through a subjective lens. So I think that everyone probably struggles with this on some level, but it's one of those things where you have to do the best that you can. And ideally, if you're working in a newsroom, make sure you have another set of eyes or another set of ears to make sure that your work is not missing a perspective, or it's not leaning in a way that you don't intend for it to lean. It's kind of a community effort is the way that I look at it.
May I follow up a minute on what Delise said? I just really agree with her about the need to be accurate, to be factual. At the same time, you also need to be aware of whether you have any unconscious biases that might show up in your reporting. So this is, you're not even aware of it. I think it's difficult for a journalist to be truly objective because everyone is a product of their upbringing, how they were raised, where they went to school, their family and their friends. The challenge and really the responsibility of journalists is to put that aside in their reporting so that they're not representing one point of view or another. Be truthful, stick to the facts, and I think you'll be on safe ground.
Thank you both. Thank you to both of you. What about now defining types of journalism? Do you see a line between service journalism, advocacy journalism, and straight news reporting?
I don't think that. I think advocacy journalism, I think if you are an advocate, I'm not sure if you are also a journalist, because if it's advocacy journalism, to me, when I hear that, I think I'm a journalist, but I have a bias that I am telling you about, and I'm writing through the lens of that bias. So it's fine if you want to advocate, but I think it's hard to also say you're also a journalist, because if you're a journalist, you are more conscious about what advocacy looks like, what it means. You might greatly limit, your advocacy because you're focused on trying to be unbiased. But if you're advocating, I feel like that puts you in maybe a separate category. And if you are a journalist and you are concerned about, let's say something like climate change, I think that, the reporting will speak for itself. Whereas you don't have to advocate per se, but if you are reporting it out, if you're doing your research, if you're including sources that are, experts on carbon emissions and whatnot, now you don't have to advocate for anything. You're letting the truth and accuracy show the reader, the news consumer, okay, this is what's happening to our planet and the environment and whatnot. So I'd be cautious about any journalist who is also labeling themselves as an advocate, whereas straight news to me seems a little bit more, that seems to be more at the core of journalism, where it's like I am reporting to you what is new and what's factual and giving you the proper context, but I'm not advocating for the news consumer to think a certain way.
I think there could also be a different view of advocacy journalism in some ways, that it's not advocating for a cause or, a particular point of view, but also advocating for change. And you see a lot of investigative reporting, going, through that lens, in which a journalist might see something that, seems wrong and needs change and needs attention brought to it to about that change. I keep going back to, the old story about Nellie Bly, who went into a institution for women who are mentally ill in New York, and to report on the conditions there, and experience firsthand what they were like, and came out and reported on them. So she went into the story with the idea that something wasn't right there and needed to be changed. Her reporting did bring about change. So investigative reporting, again, can fit into the category of advocacy journalism. What's critical is that it's reported by fact. You stick to the facts, you stick to the truth, and don't opinions into that story.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And thanks to the Journal Talks participants from just before Thanksgiving break. It was great to have you all sparking some of this discussion long after you spoke with SPJ. So now we want to move on to some of the student questions we received. We want to know what you think about the definition of journalism. Who qualifies as a journalist? And do you wish that there was a higher barrier to entry for journalism? You can go ahead and start, Delise, sorry.
I think who qualifies as a journalist is part personal and partly determined by your peers. I consider myself a journalist, but also my peers consider me a journalist. I think it's a two-way street because I think you can be a writer but not be a journalist. You can be a photographer but not be a photojournalist. But I think people who are following the core tenets of journalism in terms of being accurate, being fair, being balanced, being honest, leaving your opinion out of it, I think those are what makes you a journalist. And I think you almost, in some ways, you have to kind of show you can do that. You can't just say, I'm to show it. And I think that's when your peers kind of come in and they can say, oh yeah, you're doing it right. Or they might say, well, this doesn't quite seem to be journalism. This seems a little bit more subjective or something else. I don't know if there needs to be a higher barrier to entry. I actually think it's pretty hard to get into the industry. There are still a lot of, internships that pay near nothing at really established outlets. And unless you can afford to intern for very little pay or, things like that, it's really hard to get into the industry. I think the industry still favors people coming from certain colleges and universities, things like that. So I think I'm not sure if the barrier to entry needs to change, but I do think that there are some basic rules of the profession that should certainly be followed, in that if you are unable to follow it or if you don't want to follow it, maybe you are something else, but I'm not sure if that something else would be a journalist.
Great. And do you have a formula for how you tweet and what you tweet?
I think I tweet a little more than Carol, so I'll jump in with my very loose formula. But when I was maybe 10 years ago, when Twitter was really starting to pick up in journalism, I did have a formula of sorts where, and I think many newsrooms are kind of encouraging people to take this approach where 1/3 of your tweets were just simply like, here is the article, you're just posting an article. And then I think the second third might have been retweets. So now you're kind of sharing something that you saw from someone else. And I want to say that the final third was maybe something more personal, because you don't want to appear as though you are a bot. So maybe it is, what you made for Thanksgiving, something that's not too controversial, but it shows that your more human side, it shows a little bit of your life outside of journalism, etc. Now I don't think of it quite as precisely, but I do try to keep a balance between here's an article I'm just going to post, and here's an article that I'm going to post with some commentary. So maybe if I retweet a politician and they're announcing a new bill or a new policy, and it's something that I've reported on, I might add some context to it. Senator so-and-so has been pushing for this legislation since 2017, and that's why them sharing it is a big deal. And that's kind of what I focus on more now. I'll definitely tweet maybe if I'm watching a show or something that's completely off my beat, but it's something I enjoy. But I try to focus, I think at this point in my career, a lot on context, because there is so much misinformation. And at least I personally realized simply tweeting something, but not kind of giving your followers all the context can be is not always good. Sometimes there are legit questions about what you're tweeting, or things can just be lost in translation. Like we've seen this very, very recently on Twitter. A lot of what the president has tweeted, there's a sentence or two at the bottom saying, this might not be correct information, or I forgot the exact language. And so you kind of see, like, if I simply retweeted something from the president that was inaccurate, I more so think maybe I'm doing a disservice to my followers. So if I do tweet something and it could be misconstrued or misinterpreted, really kind of focusing on the context around it, to make sure people are clear. Yes, this newsworthy person did or said something, but here's what it really means, or here's what you should also know before you make any kind of conclusion about that.
As Delise mentioned, she tweets a lot more than I do, and I probably should do more. When I use Twitter, when I post on Twitter, it's usually retweets or tweets of articles that I find interesting, from AP and from other news organizations. I rarely will put anything personal on Twitter. On Facebook, I might post. I usually don't use Facebook for work, but I might, and that would be more personal. But again, I'm really cautious about what I put on there. And just over Thanksgiving, I posted a screenshot of my family's Zoom Thanksgiving dinner. So it's just, people could see a little bit of the personal side of me. But I'm very cautious about what I tweet or post on Facebook, because I don't want to, chance showing any type of bias.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. So while I'm thinking about that, my question, this next question, there were a couple of different people who framed this a couple of different ways. So apologies if your question was blended into this one, but a lot of people were wondering where correction should be. When you're correcting a piece, do you think that it should be right underneath the headline, right before you get to the body of the text, front and center? Do you think it's something that should be moved down to the bottom of the piece so that people can read it and then contextualize it for themselves? Should it be on a different page if you're using like a digital platform? Where geographically in a story do you think a correction belongs? And we can start with Carol on this one, and then we'll go to Delise.
Different news or organizations handle it differently. Um, Putting a correction or a notation that a story has been corrected and and how it was corrected at the top of the story ensures that your readers will see that this has been updated. Other news organizations decide, have policies that they put their corrections, they correct the story itself and then put it at the bottom, saying this story has been corrected to note X, Y, and Z. What's important, I think, is for a news organization to standardize how it's going to handle it, and to provide the correct information for the reader. I don't know that there's a better way to do it. It just needs to be done.
Delise, do you think that there's a better way to do it? How do you think it should be done?
I think that it's hard. I mean, one thing that I'm seeing more of in journalism is that where the correction is based on how egregious the error or errors were. So I've noticed that with stories that had several corrections, really big facts that were inaccurate, it might be a very long correction at the beginning of the story, like Carol mentioned, to make sure that readers are very clear that there were some mistakes and they've now been fixed. But if it's something slight, like an extra A in someone's name, something like that, I think it's okay if it's at the bottom, because you don't want the reader to kind of get tripped up on something that's minor. Certainly it should be corrected and the correction should be clear and prompt, but that's not as serious as some other major corrections that we've seen quite recently with magazines, and the corrections are several paragraphs long. They're at the top of the story, and I think it's because they were really, really big mistakes, and they couldn't even risk the reader missing that there was a correction.
Great, and that's been always something I've been actually wondering myself, so this was really good to hear. So do you think there'll be significant changes to how we fact check, and specifically with social media? We'll start with Carol this time.
I think the big changes that we're going to see in fact checking is that there's going to be more of it. Reporters, have a responsibility to hold those in power accountable for their words and for their actions. So there'll be more real-time fact checking, both on social media, in live updates, to news stories, when there are speeches, debates. One of the things that we've seen is that fact checks, get huge engagement from the public. Readers are very interested in knowing, whether, someone in power is telling the truth or not. So expect to see more of it.
I agree. I definitely think there will be more fact checkers. And I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about, who is a journalist? How is that determined? And I think people who are truly journalists will not just, as Carol mentioned, simply, I guess, post something from the press release without like double checking and maybe making some calls. I think that there will be more fact checkers because journalists are seeing, how often things that even public officials might say aren't necessarily true. And fact checking has become really popular. I think it is really necessary when there's so much misinformation being spread, that the more people we have who can fact check and clarify and say, no, that was an exaggeration, or, that's just not quite how that transpired, the better. So I'm hopeful that newsrooms will continue to invest in those types of journalists.
And I think that that's extremely important, especially when we're going to, for you all watching, going to be talking about a little bit of the race-related issues that have affected the newsroom, specifically the issue of how George Floyd's murder was reported, the things that challenged it. And one of the first questions that we got two iterations of this question. So again, apologies if in the combination of questions, we lost a little bit of the spirit here, but we are trying to uphold it. So these two people said that tons of reporters were trying to figure out how to navigate race in the wake of George Floyd's murder, specifically how we were reporting on race and reliance on police officers and the reporting that comes out of their spaces. Do you think that journalists have, even if they didn't have it before, now have a responsibility to challenge police reports and to challenge the reliance that they have on law enforcement reporting? And I will hand the baton to Carol first.
Journalists should work to verify whatever information that they get, including from official sources like police departments. Many police departments now have body cams where, try to get hold of that video, use the Freedom of Information Act or the state versions of that if it's not going to be released. But it's critical that all information be verified. Talk to witnesses, see what they say. So I don't know that I would use the word challenge, but I think, verifying all information is critical, especially in these types of stories.
I agree with Carol. I think that it's about verification, and it's an approach that you should take, whether it's a police report or if it's a press release from a government agency. I mean, you should always make phone calls, talk to other people involved to verify if the numbers in the report or the press release or the like are true, or, if there are witnesses that can corroborate the information on the report, things like that. So I think that's almost one of the core tenets of journalism, that you should always kind of check things out. You shouldn't kind of take any statement simply at face value. You should kind of do your due diligence and really work to verify that the information being presented to you is accurate and is complete. And sure, we've had situations now where reporters have done some digging and they've realized maybe the police report was not as accurate. As Carol mentioned, now there are body cameras. There's more information that we're also getting about policing, just information that we didn't have access to years before. So I think that's to the benefit of journalists, at least, because now you have a variety of different ways for double checking what's in the report. And so we should use those.
Thank you. And yeah, it's really important to check no matter who it is that you're getting the information from. And I think that's something sometimes we tend to trust sources like police right off without actually double checking, because they are the police. So now, do you think that a journalist's race or culture is important to consider when you're in the hiring process? We'll start with Karen.
You want a diverse newsroom because it brings in different ideas, different perspectives, different experiences, and which are critical to coverage. You have to consider who your audience is and how you're going to approach that audience. So yes, I think that that newsrooms, are now taking a look, at who they have on their staff and looking at ways to expand it, to bring in people with, different races, different cultures, different ethnicities, just to bring in that added perspective that will only help to enrich their journalism. One of the problems that we've seen in the news industry right now is that there have been numerous cutbacks, layoffs, especially in the middle of the pandemic. And so while, news organizations would like to be able to do that, there have been hiring freezes, so they're facing a difficult time. One of the reasons why I really like teaching at Georgetown is because we have such a diverse student body, and it's just wonderful to think about all these wonderful students who are going to enter the workforce, the journalism workforce, become reporters, editors, producers, and to be able to add to those voices.
I agree with everything Carol said. I think you should consider race and culture when you are hiring in your newsroom, when you're trying to grow your newsroom, because you don't want a situation where all of your journalists look alike, think alike, went to the same institutions. I think it's a disservice to the reader. Like, we know that we're living in a diverse country, with people with all kinds of backgrounds, living in different environments. So I think if you are reader focused, then you see clearly the value of having different types of people, and not just race, but also looking at gender and socioeconomic status, just to really ensure that you are representative, of your community, and bringing in different voices to the reporting process.
Absolutely. This is going to be our last question on race before we go through some of our more general questions that we had, or more expansive ones. So this last question came from a young queer man out in St. Louis. And his question was, what are some ideas and practicalities of media ethics that you can use and that can be utilized to create an anti-racist media space and culture specifically for Black people? As a follow-up, in this particular political moment, a lot of people are discussing the concept of anti-racism. So as a secondary question, do you think that journalism as an entity should be an anti-racist one? And I'll go ahead and start this time with Delise.
I think, every entity should be anti-racist, so journalism would not be excluded from that. But in terms of some ideas for creating an anti-racist media space, I think one thing that we've seen in the industry is that instead of having reporters on race and inequality be kind of just one beat, I think there's been a more concerted effort to make sure race and inequality is examined in every beat. So I really like the direction the industry is going in. I don't think these things should be siloed, because then you continue to other them. But if you are reporting on housing or transportation or, education, and within all of those areas, you're always conscious of, okay, how would race or, something like inequality play into this, or how is it contributing to what's happening? I think that it's a stronger approach. So I think that's one way, is for journalists to continue to do that. And I think, when you are hiring and looking to diversify your staff, you have to really be conscious of making sure that the diversity is not just in one area. It's not just at the top. It's not just at the, at the more at the bottom with newer, like younger journalists. I think it has to be throughout the newsroom. So there should be people at the, at the senior editor role that are diverse, as well as, mid-career journalists in your newsroom, as well as, news aides or, positions for people who are just starting out. And I think, again, like we're seeing that in the industry. Before, you might have a bunch of hires that were all reporters of various backgrounds, but the editors were still kind of looking the same. I think now we're seeing a change where there are more people on the masthead who are diverse. So I like the shift that we're seeing, and I think those are two ways that we can continue to make newsrooms anti-racist and just generally more inclusive.
Right. And that makes complete sense. Carol, do you have any thoughts on this? Tell us what you're thinking.
God, it's hard to follow up on Delise because I think she really nailed it. To have people in charge of newsrooms of different races, ethnicities, genders, sexual orientation, so you have, you set a standard for coverage from the top down, and you infuse in the culture of the newsroom, a non-biased, anti-racist, approach is very, very important. One thing I think of specifically in media ethics is just avoid stereotyping. So often you see stereotypes slip into reporting, whether it could be inadvertent, and get back to the unconscious bias that I mentioned earlier, that people aren't, journalists aren't even realizing what they're doing. So just be aware of the possibility of stereotypes and work to avoid them and keep them out of your reporting and writing. And
Thank you, Carol and Delise. And now shifting a little bit gears to sort of more heavy political stuff. We've seen that during Trump's presidency, we've had the media took a different role. There was a lot of talk on Twitter. So do you feel like newsrooms have gotten more transparent since Trump won in 2016? And we'll start with Delise.
I'm not sure if newsrooms have become more transparent since Trump won in 2016. I only say that because, and I've talked about this with my students as recently as this evening, but there is such a prevalence of anonymous sources in coverage of the White House and Congress. So I don't know if for the reader or the news consumer, the news is any more transparent than it was before. I think the stories are just as strong. I'm not sure if they are as transparent. And we've seen some op-eds in some major outlets, for example, the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed from someone in the Trump administration talking about the resistance and how there were all these people working within the administration, going almost against the president's wishes and things of that nature. But it was unsigned. We still don't know who wrote it. It was newsworthy, and it was certainly interesting, and it gave us a window into what was happening in the White House. But we don't know who said it. And I think that that's come up quite a bit, where we've gotten some really strong stories, and I don't doubt that the sources were strong, but because we don't know who said it for various reasons, I'm not sure if the transparency in terms of reporting has increased. But yeah, I would love to see Carol's perspective on this, because I'm not sure if I'm just too in the weeds and I'm not seeing the larger picture.
The move to transparency began even before Trump. I was on the committee that updated the SPJ ethics code, several years ago. And one of the things that was added to the code was the idea of transparency. It's an acknowledgement that, journalists should be able to explain their actions, be able to, provide, more information about sources, about where they were getting their information. So I think it's become, it's a very important value that that holds true, today and will going forward. So, yeah, I don't know that Trump was responsible for it. I think there was a recognition that to improve credibility, the public wanted a better inside view of how journalists operated, and that was the reason for it.
Absolutely. And now we're finally getting to the end, and we have our classic question. We ask it at the end of every show. So, do you have any tips for new journalists breaking into the industry? And we'll start with whoever wants to give us the first tip.
Network. Meet as many people as you can while you're still in school. At Georgetown, all our faculty are working journalists. They have connections, talk to them, be in touch with them, ask them for their advice. Guest speakers come into the classroom, most will, provide their emails and be willing to talk to students. Get to know as many people as you can. It will only help you.
And Elise?
I was going to say the same thing, actually, that I think networking is just so critical. So doing things like joining Society of Professional Journalists or National Association of Black Journalists, I mean, these are kind of the ways that you network, and a lot of your peers in class or in these organizations will help you lead you to jobs. They might give you, connect you with people. And I think it's just so critical. And the sooner you learn how to network, I think the better it will serve you in your career, because it's not something that, you only do when you're starting out and then you don't have to do it anymore. I think you have to continue to do it. And it will really help open doors and just so many different opportunities in the industry. And also, I would encourage people getting into the industry to just be open. Earlier today, I was speaking with my students about how, a lot of journalists are using TikTok now. News outlets have real verified TikTok accounts. This was something that none of us probably thought about 2 years ago. TikTok has not even been around that long. So just be open to what you can do as a journalist, how you can produce news, because the industry is constantly, shifting and changing, and you want to be flexible. You want to hold on to your core standards and the tenets of journalism, but just be open to how you might present the news.
Great. That is great advice. And we always here at the SPJ support networking, going to meet people out there. Thank you so much both for answering our questions. Delise Smith-Barrow, Georgetown Journalism Ethics Professor and Senior Editor for Higher Education at the Hettinger Report, and Carol Feldman, Interim Faculty Director, Georgetown Journalism Ethics Professor and News Editor at the Associated Press, Washington Bureau. Thank you both for joining us tonight after a long class. I'm Elena Kefalogianni.
And I am Ivy Lyons. Please don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and share this video. And feel free to join the Society of Professional Journalists right now. As our friend Delise Smith-Barrow has said, it is a great way to network. If you are a Georgetown University student, it is actually free to join our chapter. You just have to be a member of the National SPJ organization. Stay safe. Please wash your hands and wear a mask. It is so important. We don't want you to get sick. And as always, Hoya Saxa SPJ.